and we're starting a new series. And this new series is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it in a moment, but let's dive into it. And let me start by asking you this. I wonder what you're going to remember when lockdown is over, of this season of lockdown. I suppose there's the obvious things, the face masks and the social distancing and maybe the clapping on a Thursday evening. But what about, stepping back a little bit from the uniquenesses like that, and maybe also the seriousness? I mean, there's obviously a very heavy seriousness about what is happening globally. First of all, with COVID-19, now with all that's happening in the news with Black Lives Matter, there's just so much serious stuff. But if we take a step back and just think in terms of, it sounds so trite, but just thinking in terms of entertainment, what are we going to remember? What are we going to look back on when we look back on lockdown? Well, I've read a couple of articles that have been vehement, like absolutely convinced that the one highlight of lockdown has been a series of documentaries called The Last Dance. Don't know if you've seen it, but it's a 10-part documentary released by ESPN focusing on Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls back in the 80s and especially the 90s. And the series has kind of told the story. And what's been so special about it, I think, is that they've had a lot of footage that has never been seen before. So if you grew up in that era and you watched basketball, I'll be honest, I don't think I ever saw a single Chicago Bulls game, live or recorded, but everybody knew who Michael Jordan was. And here we are 20 plus years later, and this documentary seems to have captured the imagination of so many people. I think part of that is because there's been no other sport to watch on TV. So for a lot of people, they kind of gravitated to whatever they could find. But I think another part of it is that the series is focused on an era that didn't have the kind of coverage that we have today. Oh, there was the internet, but it was new and we didn't really use it a whole lot, did we, in the mid-90s? And that it was before the time of social media, and so the constant coverage and the constant kind of smartphone access to everybody in the world, it wasn't there. And so if you grew up in the 80s, 90s, or if you were around, you would have heard reports. Maybe you might have seen matches. You might have caught the odd interview. Or maybe all you saw was Space Jam, a movie where Michael Jordan joins Bugs Bunny and some other cartoon characters to win a must-win basketball game against some invading aliens or something like that. It was probably based on a true story, I'm not sure, but Space Jam was for some people what they knew of Michael Jordan. And then I've got this weird feeling, I said Michael Jackson earlier, I hope I didn't, but I'm talking about Michael Jordan. And then for some people, there was a cartoon that was just like a caricature of Michael Jordan's basketball ability and his kind of hero status. And for some people, that's all they knew of Michael Jordan. And then this documentary has come out with footage that nobody's seen before and with up close and very candid interviews with Michael Jordan and some of the other players and coaches and so on. It's fascinating how getting a little glimpse into somebody's life can really draw people in. I have to say that for me, the highlight of lockdown, if we're going to talk about watching something on TV, the highlight for me has been watching The Chosen. Don't know if you've seen it. The Chosen is a new TV drama based on the life of Jesus. And the first series came out at just the right time. And so as lockdown began, as a family, we just grabbed a whole load of evenings and watched right the way through that first series. If you haven't seen it, I'd really encourage you to take a look because it is absolutely brilliant. It's like you're there, and they've done such a good job of developing the characters and especially the character of Jesus. It's like he's real. Do you know what I mean? It's like every other movie or TV depiction of Jesus suddenly feels like a cartoon in comparison. Because on The Chosen, it's like every time he comes on screen, I find myself leaning forward and smiling like I'm gripped by the personality that comes through that series. And that's really what we want now as we head into this preaching series for the summer. We thought about it. We've just done this series that Anina referred to, where we talked about emotions stirred up in lockdown. But now what do we need? And we really feel that what we need is to spend some good time with Jesus. To spend some time watching him, listening to him, hearing from him. And I think that often what's happened in church world is that we've portrayed Jesus in kind of, I don't know if this is a phrase, I'm just making it up, but in kind of a stained glass cartoon. You know what I mean? Like stained glass, so it's kind of reverent and careful, but cartoon in the sense that it doesn't feel real. You know, it's almost like Jesus sort of floats through the stories of the Bible, and then he does things that are very kind and nice, but we don't engage with his personality. We don't get to see what he's really like, perhaps as much as we should. And that's really the goal, that over these next few weeks, as we jump into John's Gospel together, the hope is that we will be able to, if you like, go from cartoon Jesus, I say that respectfully, but you know what I mean, go from sort of caricature or Sunday school story Jesus to, well, I suppose at least to a documentary Jesus, but better than that. You see that the ultimate way to know somebody is not to watch a documentary that's trying to make them look good. The ultimate way to know somebody is to spend time with them, to live with them for a few months, to watch them in action, to see their reactions and how they function in life. And that's really my hope, is that we will be able to come into John's Gospel with our hearts open, with our imaginations turned on. And for the next few months, couple of months, we're going to work our way through John 5, 6, 7, and 8. And, excuse me, I'm trying not to sneeze. It's becoming obvious, isn't it? And so we're going to be in these 4 chapters, and we're going to be taking our time working through them. And hopefully what we can see here is that Jesus was a real person. More than that, he's a compelling person, somebody that when we notice him, when we look closely at him, we get to see what an amazing, unique person Jesus is. Often you'll hear people talk about how they became Christians. And sometimes it was explained to me, and the truths kind of made sense, and it made sense of the world for me. Sometimes that's the story. Sometimes, maybe often, the story is, well, I looked into it, or I read the Bible, or I heard something, I heard somebody preaching, and there was something about Jesus. I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't say what it was, but I couldn't shake it. I was drawn to Jesus, and that is completely appropriate because he is the heart of Christianity. And that's my hope for all of us, is that as we spend time in John 5, 6, 7, and 8, that we will be drawn to Jesus, that we'll say, wow, it's like I've never seen him before. It's like I'm noticing things that are more vivid, more captivating, more compelling about him than I've realized. My hope is that as we look at this, it will stir in us an appetite to know him more all week, that we'll be kind of pondering what he was like, is like, and that we would find our hearts warmed by that. It may be that you're watching this and you're kind of glad that this is just on a screen, so you feel awkward maybe going to church or something, but you think, oh, I'll watch this. And maybe you're looking at this saying, well, I don't know Jesus the way you people talk about him. Great. We're really glad that you're here. Our hope is that you'll find you can't stop thinking about him. That you'll find that he's far more compelling, the real version in the Bible, than the cartoon stained glass version that maybe you've heard before or thought of. That Jesus is more than the way he's portrayed. And for those of us that do know Jesus and love Jesus already, my hope is that it would just grow stronger, and that we'll find that actually at this difficult time in the world, with all the things that are going on, what do we need? Yeah, we need a cure for COVID-19. We need a solution, an end to racism. We need a solution to this problem and that problem. Maybe we need some help financially in light of all that's gone on. There's a whole list of needs, but our ultimate need is that we need Jesus. We need to be gripped by him. We need to know him. We need to draw close to him. We need to allow him to captivate our hearts in a way that our hearts have never been captivated before. Now, why are we jumping in at John chapter 5? Well, a while ago we did John 1, 2, 3 and 4. That's not a reason to jump in at 5. A better reason is because it's a natural starting point if we're going to look at this part of the gospel. John is a document, a book that is 21 chapters long. And the first 4 chapters function a bit like an introduction. There's a proper introduction in chapter 1. Actually, the whole of chapter 1 gives us a whole set of testimonies about who Jesus is. But then you come into chapters 2, 3, and 4, and they kind of hold together. You see, they begin and they end in the town of Cana, a place we never hear of, apart from in those 2 locations in the Gospels. And they begin and they end with a miracle that Jesus does in Cana, the water into wine at the wedding, and then the official's son. And in between, there's a sequence of stories basically showing us that people were drawn to Jesus, and that people found that they could grow in belief in Jesus, that there was this kind of effect that he had both on Jewish people and on non-Jewish people. And that's what chapters 2, 3, and 4 are presenting. It's like they're laying the foundation for what's to come. But what's to come kicks off in chapter 5. And so we're jumping in at chapter 5, because if we miss this, what we're going to see today, this little incident at the start of chapter 5, is actually the inciting incident that creates tension, that takes Jesus all the way through the final year, from the year before the first Easter, the springtime, which is where this story takes place, right the way through 12 months to the first Easter, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem and accomplishes the mission for which he was sent. All of that begins here. This is where the tension is created. This is where the religious leaders get frustrated to the point that they want to have him killed. And so we're going to jump in and we're going to look at John chapter 5, just the story at the start of the chapter. Next week we'll look at the rest of it. But what we're going to find when we look at Jesus in this story is that he's not the passive, reactionary, kind of gentle do-gooder that we've often presented him to be. You know, the sort of stained glass floating Jesus who just happens to be in the right place at the right time when people need him and they cry out to him and he does nice things. That's not the way Jesus is presented here. Jesus is presented here as somebody who takes initiative, who steps in, who acts, and who is willing to bravely drive a situation forward. The kind of person that if you were there, if you were watching, and if you had eyes to see, you'd be looking around thinking, who is that guy? Because that's impressive. I want us to see 3 times in this little story where Jesus takes initiative. We're going to see it in the story, and then we're going to suggest that it's the same Jesus who's at work today. The same Jesus who takes initiative in our lives too. So let's jump in. John chapter 5, starting at verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. So this is setting the scene. This is the situation. And I just want you to notice the level of detail that we're being given here. And just make this as a side comment as we're kind of diving into the story. Every few years there is a rumor, an idea that gets promoted that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4 documents that are in our New Testament, are the wrong Gospels, and that there are some other Gospels that should have been chosen and should be honoured by the church. And every couple of decades, something, a book or a film will come out and push that idea. The last one that I really was aware of was the Da Vinci Code. Was that 2006? But it was the same thing about 20 years before that. The idea that there were all these other Gospels around, the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas and all these other documents. And why didn't the church put those into our Bibles? Why did they choose these 4? Well, one reason why they did was because these 4 are genuine. These 4 are eyewitness accounts. If you go to any of those, in fact, go to all of the other so-called gospels, the ones that are questionable, and look simply for geographical detail. In all of those supposedly better gospels that are floating around out there, you'll find there is one place that is named, and that is Jerusalem. No details, just the city of Jerusalem. Then you come back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what do you find? You find this kind of detail. Detail that is incredibly accurate. In fact, detail that for many centuries couldn't be confirmed, but archaeology has confirmed it. And today you can go to Jerusalem, and just north of the Temple Mount is the Sheep Gate, and just inside that gate is the Pool of Bethesda with the roofed colonnades, evidence of them, and the pool itself. It's exactly what is described here, because this is the testimony of an eyewitness. We can trust the Gospel of John. It is a trustworthy document that is inviting us to look at Jesus. And so here's this situation. There are all these people that are lying around this pool, and there's this one particular man who's been there for a very, very long time, 38 years. He's been an invalid. Don't know if he's been there for 38 years, although that is kind of the implication. He's been there for a very long time at least. And Jesus takes the initiative. Look at verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there, and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, we don't know what the deal was really with that pool. In fact, you'll notice that in most of our Bibles, verse 4 is missing. The reason for that is not a typo. It's because verse 4 was added a lot later as a sort of explanation. And so some Bibles have a verse 4 that say something like an angel would come down from heaven and stir the waters, and the first person in would get healed. That was added. And we think it was added to try to make sense of what the man is saying here in verse 7. When the water's stirred up, I can't get in quick enough. Can't do it. Every time somebody beats me. Now, we don't know anything about angels and stirring of water. It's interesting, actually, that in John 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's lots of references to water. In chapter 4, Jesus had a conversation with the woman at the well, and he talked to her about water for quite a long chunk of that conversation. Here, Jesus ignores the water. He doesn't make a thing of it. He doesn't talk about the living water within him or any of that kind of stuff. He just deals with the man, very direct. And I love the fact here that in verse 6, the man doesn't call out to Jesus. Jesus saw him lying there. Jesus recognized that this man was in need, and this was the man that he chose to do something for. He recognized he'd been there a long time, so he asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" The man said, explained it away why he hadn't been healed. And Jesus kind of just cuts to the bottom line. Get up, take your bed, and walk. It's bold, it's direct. It's definitely taking the initiative, and amazingly, this man stood up. After 38 years of being an invalid, with all the wasted muscle gone and all the, just the total lack of strength, suddenly there is strength in the legs, strength in the core, strength in the back, coordination. It's miraculous. And this man stands to his feet, takes up his mat, and he starts walking. He does exactly what he's told. Now, I wonder what he did next. There's another story of a man that comes in the book of Acts a little bit later. Another man crippled about, what would it have been, 50, 100 meters from here? Just inside the temple court area, at the gate to the entrance to the temple, the point beyond which no crippled man could go. He was sat there begging for money. And one day Peter and John walked past him on their way into the temple, and he asked them for money, and they said, we've got no silver or gold, but I'll tell you what, we've got one thing you can have. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk. And this man stood up, and he didn't just walk. He went running and leaping and celebrating, and he shot straight into that temple for the first time to celebrate and to worship God. He wasn't allowed in as a crippled person. but now made whole, the first thing on his heart was to get in there and celebrate the goodness of God to him. Well, all we have here is that this man took up his bed and he walked, but then we get told the problem. The end of verse 9, we're told that the day that this happened was the Sabbath. Not good. Not good at all from a Jewish perspective. Because it's a Sabbath. Jesus does seem to enjoy doing things on the Sabbath. I kind of think there's a provocative playfulness, or maybe even less playful about that, but he really does seem to go to town, as it were, on the Sabbath. And so this day is the Sabbath, and the Jews, that is the religious leaders, that's who that's really referring to, the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "Whoa, you've been healed, praise the Lord. Let's not worry about details. What's going on? Tell us about it." No, they didn't say that. They said, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed." Now, that sounds nitpicky, doesn't it? Sounds fussy, and it really is in one sense. But you've got to understand that the way that culture worked, like a lot of cultures in our world, is that the police force, the criminal court system, wasn't separate from the people. The people themselves, especially the leaders amongst the people, they would function like the police and like the judge and like the jury and sometimes like the executioner as well. That was their way of working. And so when they saw that man carrying the mat, they're not just saying, "Oi, sunshine, stop doing that. That's naughty." They're not just telling him off. They're accusing him and setting up a court scene. Like, this is serious. This could escalate very, very quickly. Now, what I find interesting about this is the man's response. They say it's not lawful for you to take up your bed. He answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said, take up your bed and walk." They said, "Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Now, it's interesting that the moment they point the finger at him, he immediately says it's somebody else's fault. It's human nature, isn't it? You know, we hear it all the time. "Excuse me, you did something wrong there." "Yeah, but," and there's always often somebody else to blame for it. It's not just the children, is it? We do it ourselves as adults. "Yeah, but if you hadn't said that, I wouldn't have." And it's human nature. And so there's this kind of human nature response. The moment the accusation comes, he's saying somebody else, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, right? Maybe it's fair enough. Maybe he was conscientious, didn't want to be carrying his mat on the Sabbath, didn't want to do anything wrong, and now suddenly everyone's looking at him and accusing him. Maybe he's just kind of saying, "Well, I just do what I was told. If someone's got the power to, kind of give me legs, then I'm going to do what they tell me." Let's give him the benefit of the doubt for a moment. Verse 14. Jesus takes initiative again. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." What's Jesus talking about? Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Honestly, I'm not sure. It could be that Jesus is saying to the man that you're being an invalid for 38 years was as a result of sin. It could be that. It's sometimes definitely not that. It's not always that, absolutely. It could be. It doesn't feel like it to me, but I'm not certain of that. It could be that Jesus was saying your whole life has been characterized by sin. You need to stop sinning. Sin is the real issue here. It could be that Jesus is saying you're being drawn into a sin specifically at this moment. Don't do it. It could be you're about to do something wrong. This is a warning. I'm not sure, but Jesus is putting his finger on the real issue with this man. You see, when Jesus first took initiative, he engaged the man at the level of what he felt was his need, at the level of what was obvious. He couldn't walk. Jesus healed that graciously. But now Jesus seeks him out for a second time and says, hang on, we need to talk about something more important, more at the root of who you are than your legs. more at the heart of who you are than your ability to walk. Don't sin. Sin is the problem. Now, I'd like to think that at this moment the man is kind of cut to the heart and responsive to Jesus. But look at verse 15. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Now, I don't know what you want to call that. What did you call that when you were at school? Being a grass? Being a snitch? Whatever label you have for that, it's not really very kind at all, is it? We gave this man the benefit of the doubt a couple of verses ago, but now he is using his newfound legs to march straight off to the authorities and to hand them a business card with Jesus' number on it. Before, they were asking questions. He didn't know. Jesus had slipped away. And it's a little bit strange that he didn't know, but now he's going to them. He's seeking them out and saying, excuse me, guys, you want to know who told me to carry my mat? It's that man Jesus. You need to get him. It's weird that this man who's just been healed goes off and passes on the accusation. It's a little bit like, I sometimes use the illustration of the police stopping somebody in our culture. Excuse me, sir, what's that in your pocket? And they discover a little bit of drugs, a little packet, a little small amount, recreational use, right? Well, what does the person always want to do? They want to get away. They don't want to get into trouble. And so, hey, don't prosecute me for carrying. I can give you the dealer. And that's kind of what's happening here. The man's saying, don't prosecute me for carrying my mat. I can give you the dealer, the one who is promoting Sabbath breaking. And the first chance he gets, he goes to them and he gives them the name of Jesus. And we're told in verse 16, this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. That could be translated prosecuting in this context, because that's what they want to do. They want to prosecute Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. There's two moments of initiative that we've seen. Firstly, Jesus comes to the man and heals him. Secondly, Jesus finds the man again and addresses the sin that is in his heart, in his life. There's another story in John's Gospel of a man that Jesus healed. This other man is in John 9. He's blind from birth, and Jesus heals him. And he gets called in to explain what's happening by the religious leaders. Only his response is so different. He's faced with this panel of experts who are demanding that he tell them that Jesus is a sinner and that Jesus has done wrong. And he says, look, I don't know. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. They push him a couple more times and he starts poking his finger in their chest. He starts saying to them, hey, do you want to believe in him as well? I mean, it's incredible. He's like, what's going on? You're fussing about breaking the Sabbath. He gave me sight. Have you ever heard of anything like this before? That's the response that I would want to see in this guy here. And yet he gives the exact opposite. His newfound strength, his newfound legs are used to march right to the authorities and to get Jesus in trouble. I don't think this man understood what Jesus was all about. Jesus had come to him and healed him. And Jesus had sought him out again and effectively warned him. But he hadn't taken it on board. And as far as he was concerned, he needed to still protect himself. Now, so far, the story, I think, kind of makes sense. We can track with it. We can say, yeah, okay, I don't agree with the man's actions, but I kind of like the way Jesus works. It's bold, it's direct. But then you come to verse 17, and verse 17, to me, it just kind of blows my circuits. Every time I look at this, I think, man, if I was Jesus, which I'm not, but if I was Jesus, I would be wary. Right? You've got the authorities of Jerusalem on your case if you're Jesus at this point. They've been alerted to the fact that Jesus is going around telling people to break the Sabbath from their perspective. And so he's in trouble. Sabbath breaking is something that the Jewish authorities, they would take it seriously. They'd want to clamp down on that, to try to maintain order, to try to keep the religious distinctiveness of their culture. And so they're persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. And so Jesus shows initiative for the third time. Look down at verse 17. But Jesus answered them, "My Father, who is working until now, and I am working." My Father is working until now, and I am working. Honestly, if Jesus is trying not to get in trouble, this is about the worst thing he could possibly say. Absolute disaster of a statement. I mean, if Jesus is kind of in PR mode, if Jesus is, running towards an election, trying to handle things well, this is a disaster, but that's not what he's about. Effectively, do you kind of see what's going on here? Effectively, the police have arrived and they've said to Jesus, "Look, we got this guy over here on carrying his mat on the Sabbath, but he told us that he would give us the dealer, which means that he's no longer in trouble because now we're here for you. You're breaking the Sabbath." And it's like Jesus says, seriously? Don't just charge me with breaking the Sabbath. If you're going to charge me with something, let me give you something to charge me with. It's like Jesus hands them on a plate a far greater crime in their eyes. I mean, everything he says, "My Father." The Jews would never say that. The Jews would say, "Our Father." To say "my Father," it would sort of take their breath away slightly. Who does he think he is? And then he says, "My Father is working until now." Of course, they would know that the Father would be working in terms of giving life on the Sabbath. Babies would be born on the Sabbath. I mean, God is still good on the Sabbath. So sure, God's working until now, but until now is like 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday. You don't draw attention to it. It's awkward when you're the one being accused of breaking the Sabbath. But Jesus does that, and then he makes it really clear that he's equating himself with the Father because he says, "And I am working." And so if God is working on the Sabbath, I am working on the Sabbath. How could that possibly be a problem? There you go. Charge me with that. Do you see what he's done? Jesus has said to them, "Look, I'm here on a mission. And the mission includes you being antagonized by me. It includes you ultimately taking me and killing me." He knows that's his mission. And he's not going to just mess around with a lesser charge that leads to some kind of slap on the wrist, legally speaking. He says, "No, if we're going to start this, then let's really go for it. I am equal with God." Go for blasphemy. It wasn't blasphemy because Jesus is God. Jesus is the Son of God, equal with the Father. Jesus is the one who can give life. He is the one who can judge. All the things that are true of God are true of him. He's ready to talk about that with them. And so he ramps it up. Don't mess around with lesser charges. Let's go for the real issue. Who am I? I love his boldness, don't you? I love that Jesus is so kind and so caring and so gentle, but where necessary, so willing to take the initiative and say it as it is. Look at verse 18. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. See how serious it's got? Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Wow. 3 times Jesus takes the initiative in this story. The first time he takes the initiative to meet the needs of this helpless person who is hurting, frustrated. His life's a mess, and Jesus steps into his situation and deals with his issue as an act of kindness. Secondly, Jesus seeks him out because fixing his legs doesn't fix his problem. And so the second time, Jesus finds the man and flags up for him that sin is the real issue. And then thirdly, when the authorities come at Jesus, instead of cowering, instead of pulling back, instead of hiding or trying to deflect or point to somebody else, he just ramps up the charge and says, "All right, we're going to do this. I'm ready to die." That's the beauty of Jesus' initiative here, is that it is so giving, so kind, so selfless, but also so incredibly brave. Who would have the courage to do what Jesus does here? Well, Jesus, because he's unique in that sense. Uniquely aware of the future, uniquely aware of the implications, and uniquely willing to step forward and make history happen. I wonder if he follows that same three-part initiative process even today. I wonder if Jesus proactively works in people's lives. Maybe when they don't even realize that they need him, and he just kind of gets in there by his Spirit, just kind of stirring things up for them. Maybe people get into a tough spot and they cry out to him, but sometimes people are in a tough spot and God does something in their lives anyway. It could be disease, it could be debt, it could be a difficult situation. I wonder if people in the midst of this COVID crisis, how many people in the world have cried out, God, if you're there, I can't breathe, rescue me. God, if you're there, do something for my loved one. I wonder if maybe there have been answers to prayers stated in desperation or even not said. But God knows that simply giving somebody more time or better legs or better finances is not fixing the heart of the problem. And so God, by his Spirit, Jesus, by his Spirit, follows up with us. So yeah, I'm glad to care for you. I love you. But I love you too much to leave you without dealing with that sin issue inside of you. You see, that second step that Jesus takes is so profound, isn't it? That he doesn't simply want to make our lives comfortable. Doesn't simply want to fix the immediate problem that is before us. He's willing to. He's incredibly gracious and kind. But ultimately, Jesus knows that our real issue is a heart issue. That our real problem is a sin problem. And not only is he ready to point it out, to convict us, to wake us up to our need of a Saviour, but he's also willing to take the steps necessary to save us. Just as we see here, Jesus, a year before the first Easter, saying, charge me with blasphemy if you're not prepared to accept me for who I am. He's literally starting the clock. He's turning over the sand timer, and the sand is going through, and the point in time is coming where he is going to be taken and he is going to be hung on the cross, because it was his plan and his purpose, his Father's plan and purpose for him to come into this world, not only to do good things for us, not even just to show us what our problem was, but to take care of it as well. That's what you call initiative. And that's what Jesus is like. Let me encourage you, read this passage closely. Try to imagine it in your minds. Try to imagine it from Jesus' perspective, taking the initiative the first time, the second time, and the third time. And then maybe ask God to show you how he is still taking that initiative even today. How is God reaching out to care for you in your situation? Maybe in ways you haven't even noticed. How is God at work in your life, shining a light into the recesses of your life to say, hey, there are issues here, and the real issue ultimately is sin? And how is God shining the light of his Spirit onto the reality of what Jesus has done for us? That he has already taken the initiative, he's already gone to the cross. He's done for us what we could never do for ourselves. Praise God that Jesus is not just floating around in some kind of stained glass cartoon niceness. Instead, he's willing to get right up close and personal with you and with me. To help us, to show kindness to us, to care for us, but to show us the ultimate kindness. To show us the real issue which is deep inside of us, and not just to show it to us, but to do whatever it would take to take care of it for us. Next week, we're going to see what happens, because this story is not over. Jesus is in serious trouble, and next week we're going to see how he handles that situation. We're going to watch him in action. But before we get there, let me encourage you just to ponder the Jesus who is revealed in these 18 verses, the one who takes initiative, the one who loves you, the one who was willing to die for you.